Well, thank you. It's good to be here with you today. I usually start with a little bit of music, but apparently the video is not working, so we'll just have to imagine the music. I was going to show you Intermezzo, which is a piece by a Mexican composer, but maybe you can look it up during the week. Intermezzo by Manuel M. Ponce, or maybe we can try next week with another computer or so. Will you pray with me? Merciful God, as we reflect on Erikson's life cycle theory, grant us the ability to reflect with self-compassion on our own life trajectories. May your spirit enable us to revisit our lives with a sense of gratitude for the past, awareness for the present, and hope for the future. And as we reflect on our own life trajectories, may we also extend a sense of kindness to our relatives, friends, and neighbors. As Psalm 90:12 puts it, teach us to count our days that we may gain a wise heart. In Christ's name we pray. Amen. Well, once again, it's good to be here with you in the classroom, and good to be on Zoom for those who are joining us via Zoom. So let me just say a little bit more about myself. As Drake explained, I am originally from Mexico City, born and raised Presbyterian in a church in downtown Mexico City. Went to seminary in Mexico and ministered at 3 churches in Mexico before coming to grad school in New Jersey. I also used to teach at the Presbyterian Seminary in Mexico City. And actually, the original purpose of coming to Princeton was to continue teaching at the Presbyterian Seminary in Mexico. But you all know how church politics go. And you may know a little bit about the theological differences between the church in the US and the church in Mexico. And when the PCUSA decided to extend its ordination standards here, was that 2012 or around that time, the denomination in Mexico decided to sever ties with the PCUSA. So that put me in trouble, right? Because I was kind of in the middle. I was at a PCUSA seminary, but I was officially part of the church in Mexico. So to make a long story short, they basically told me, you are on your own. Thankfully, my mentor at Princeton Seminary, Dr. Robert Dykstra, was very, always looking out for me. And he said, well, if they don't want you, you look for a job here, apply for jobs here. And as you may know, the field of pastoral care is a very small field. We basically just get jobs at seminaries, which are not too many. But that year was especially, there were several openings. One of them was at the Iliff School of Theology, which is a United Methodist seminary. So I applied and I got that job. But then when Ken McFadden, the dean at UPSAM, visited Denver to invite people, there was a meeting of pastoral theologians in Denver. So he visited that meeting and he presented UPSAM and he said how wonderful it was. And it was, of course, Presbyterian, and I had always been Presbyterian. So for me, it was no brainer applying to that job. And well, here I am. I'm really glad to be here. Never in my life did I imagine that I would one day be teaching Sunday school in a PCUSA English-speaking church. But, God has God's ways. And I'm glad to be here with you. So we'll be talking about Erik Erikson. Maybe the healthy aging. I hope that will come through today, but it will come more intentionally next Sunday. Today, we're going to be a little bit of the heavy theory. So feel free to interrupt me if at any point you feel like you need clarification or you need a further explanation on anything. just raise your hand or unmute yourself on Zoom. I'm happy to answer any questions. We don't have to wait till the end. We can, you can just do it as we go. So I'll share my screen because some of these concepts are easier. Well, we can have some graphic information. So I've always thought that Erikson's life cycle theory can be a wonderful resource for our self-reflection. As human beings, as people of God, here I have a picture of Erik and Johan Eriksson. So the Eriksons actually met in Vienna at a dance, according to Erik's biographers. They met at a ball dance in Vienna. Erik was born in Germany of a Danish mother and a Danish father whom he never met. And Johan was Canadian, Episcopalian Canadian, but she was in Vienna. So that's where they met. And as soon as they met, they, decided to get together, and they eventually married and had kids. And eventually they migrated to the United States when the influence of Hitler was increasing in Europe. They migrated to the United States, where he found lots of spaces where he worked in the academy and in research, despite the fact that he never had a college degree. The only thing he ever had was a diploma, a Montessori diploma that he got in Vienna. But despite that fact, he taught at Yale, he taught at Harvard, he taught at Berkeley, University of California. So he was widely influential in establishing the idea of the human life cycle, which is what we will look at today. So Erik, in 1915, his book Childhood and Society, which became his most influential and well-known book, he had a chapter which was called The 8 Stages of Man. And back then, people used predominantly male language, but this chapter really included humanity in general. So he referred to, in that chapter, to the 8 stages of human development, and those you can see on the screen: infancy, early childhood, the play age, school age, adolescence, young adulthood, adulthood, and older adulthood. Now, let me just explain that Erikson did not assign these numbers. Those ranges that you see in parentheses, those were assigned or have been assigned by scholars of Erikson's theories. Why? Because Erikson thought that, especially during the second half of our life, beginning in adolescence, there can be a lot of variation, depending on a person's unique circumstances. Someone can, mature more quickly, especially during the adolescence period. He thought, depending on the circumstances of a person, someone could go through adolescence relatively quickly. And in other cases, it can take a while to develop the tasks of adolescence. He has a book, for example, on young man Martin Luther, which is called Young Man Luther, which is one of my favorite books by Erikson. But in that book, his hypothesis is that Martin Luther went through a very long period of identity crisis, even to his early 30s, in part due to his theological and religious conflicts. So that is to illustrate that during the second half of our life, those stages can vary a lot in terms of numbers. But those numbers really were not assigned by Erikson, were assigned by people after Erikson, who wanted some greater clarity on what each of these stages entailed in terms of numbers. So of course, each of us, when we look at this, each of us, our instant impulse is to try to locate ourselves. Where are we, right? Increasingly so, older adulthood is considered 70, sometimes some people say even 75 plus. So the last quarter of 100, given the increasing longevity that we are experiencing, at least in some parts of the world. So those are the 8 stages of human development.
I have a question
Sure.
for you. So, like, not all that long ago, like the 1800s and early 1900s, people were only living to be like 40 years old on average.
Mhm.
So how does that, I mean, would the age have been, those ages been adjusted way down based on that, or?
Yes, that's an excellent question. And that's maybe one of the reasons that Erikson did not assign a number, because he was very aware. He was, he traveled to several places in the world, especially India. He was also in Mexico for a while. And he was aware of cultural differences and variations. So I think my hypothesis, at least, is that this is one of the reasons that for which he didn't assign any numbers, because he was aware that that could really vary. But yes, and we'll talk a little bit more about that later, maybe today or next Sunday. But some people have suggested adding 2 additional stages, given the increasing longevity that we are experiencing in contemporary times. But we'll talk about that more. Oh, there's a, yeah.
From what little I read to get ready to come and listen to you today, I understand that Erikson's theory is that you move in each stage, you have a conflict, and if you successfully resolve the conflict, you become a better person personality wise, and if you don't, it's kind of a setback. So my question is this: unlike school, where you graduate from 5th grade to 6th grade at the end of 5th grade, whether it's a social promotion or otherwise, was Erikson's theory that you're going to move from one stage to another at some point, regardless of how you met your conflict and resolved it?
Yes, and I'm going to get into that in just a second, but someone did, homework in anticipation of this class. But yes, I'll actually get to that, I think, in the next slide, but we'll get to there. And if I don't answer your question, just feel free to let me know. So this is exactly what you were pointing out right here. Erikson thought that each of these stages entails what he called a psychosocial crisis. Now, by crisis, it's important to understand what he meant by crisis. Sometimes, as you know, there's a crisis can have a negative connotation or a connotation of conflict or even trauma. But in this case, from the developmental point of view, this is what he meant by crisis: a turning point, a crucial period of increased vulnerability and heightened potential. But it has a much more positive approach of the word crisis. So it's a moment of opportunity, a moment of growth, a moment in which the individual, both by physiological and emotional, psychological conditions, is ready to move on to a new stage. That's what he meant by crisis. And as you were suggesting here, each crisis has 2 components. So therefore, this image that you see on the screen. On the one hand, it has a syntonic or positive element. And on the other hand, a dystonic or negative element. When we say positive, negative, we don't mean that in moral terms, but in terms of psychology or psychological development. In other words, if it contributes to healthy development or not. So a syntonic element and a dystonic element. Now, what is interesting here is that Erikson thought that, one would ordinarily imagine that what is ideal is to have 100% of the syntonic element. So he actually thought that a little bit of the dystonic element, negative, was would contribute to healthy development. Now, he didn't put numbers to that ratio between the syntonic and the dystonic, but other scholars, Eriksonian scholars after Erikson, including Donald Capps, who was one of my professors at Princeton Seminary, he thought that the ratio would be something like 70-30 or 75-25. So he really thought that there had to be some room for that dystonic element. And we'll illustrate that in a second. But for example, during infancy, the baby, the task of infancy, according to Erikson, was trust, which is a syntonic element, versus mistrust, which is a dystonic element. But to illustrate the point is, let me say, the baby trusts the maternal person, usually the mother. And that relationship of trust is necessary for healthy development. But here, Capps explained that a little bit of mistrust is necessary to preserve the baby's viability. In order to survive, the baby has to mistrust other people. And you see that, right? When you approach a baby, I don't know, 6-month, a 9-month baby, and the baby doesn't know you, the baby won't go with you. Will be very, will think about it a lot before going with you. So that's a sign, that's an example of mistrust, a little bit of mistrust, which is the dystonic element, which is actually contributing to the healthy development of the baby. Because if the infant would take anything or would go with anyone, that would most likely jeopardize that baby's life. So that's a nice example of the importance of that dystonic element, even though there has to be more of the syntonic element for healthy development. So here are the 8 psychosocial crises that you were referring to. Infancy, basic trust versus basic mistrust. Early childhood, autonomy versus shame and doubt. During the play age, initiative versus guilt. Then comes industry versus inferiority during the school age. Adolescence, identity versus identity confusion. Young adulthood, intimacy versus isolation. Adulthood, generativity versus stagnation. And mature adulthood, integrity versus despair. So those are the psychosocial crises, and you can see in each one that the syntonic element, which will be the first one, and the dystonic element would be the second one in each pair. And I'll explain some of these more in detail in just a few minutes. Now here's an interesting fact. Joanne Erikson, Erikson's wife, she confessed at some point in her life that she didn't really understand his husband. That's not rare, right? We've all been there, right? Especially he didn't understand some of Erikson's, complex theory until she did this. Here's Joanne Erikson, and she says that she actually started weaving, playing with this weaving. And in this weaving, you can see 8 colors on the background, and then another color, which is kind of greenish or grayish. And she thought that this is when she actually understood Erikson's theory, when she actually started doing this weaving, and she realized that the 8 colors on the back, those are the syntonic elements, and the dystonic element would be the grayish or greenish yarn that she was using. And that's a beautiful illustration because it's a beautiful way of explaining the interplay between the syntonic and the dystonic. So the dystonic is actually making the syntonic elements more, brighter, more apparent to your eyes. But I always find it interesting that she, that she really never really got it until she actually did it with her hands. And some of us are that kind of learner. We need to do some kind of activity in order to get the theory. So that's a nice example of the integration of the syntonic and the dystonic. So in his book, Life Cycle Theory and Pastoral Care, Donald Capps was studied or dedicated a lot of his life to study Erikson's theory and to study the application of Erikson's theories for the church and for pastoral care. He actually points this out, which is related to the question that was made earlier. He says, the question is not whether, but how one progresses through the appointed stages. Good progress at one stage increases your chances for good progress at the next stage. So in other words, Erikson thought that the progress we make in each of these stages is cumulative. If you develop a sense of trust during infancy, then you'll come with a better sense of preparation to the next stage in life, and so on, so on. So that begs the question, of course, what happens if someone does not achieve enough of a sense of trust? For example, an infant who has not had consistent mothering person, that person's development will be somewhat jeopardized. But Erikson also thought, and we'll get there in a second, that there's always a possibility of going back to rework a previous task in your life. So if you look at these stages and you kind of get the sense that I'm not sure I did very well there, you can always go back and kind of rework that task. Sometimes, you can do that work in your own. Sometimes you might need the help of someone, a minister, a therapist, a counselor. But what I like about this theory is that it is open to the possibility of reworking previous tasks in our lives. So in that sense, it carries a sense of hope very profoundly. So another component of this theory, Erikson's theory, is what he called the epigenetic principle, which he borrowed, of course, from the field of epigenetics, of embryology and biology. So the idea here is that each element of the cycle is systematically related to all others. And I'll explain more of that in a second. That also entails that overall development depends on the proper development and the proper sequence. And that each element exists in some form before its decisive time of ascendancy. And that perhaps is better illustrated with this chart. As you can see here, each of the stages is related to all the others. So for example, let's take a look at adolescence, which is right in the middle. The task of adolescence is identity versus identity confusion. So even if you are an adolescent, there is a way in which your identity confusion is also related to, the previous stage, industry versus inferiority, or even to stages in the future of your trajectory, intimacy versus isolation. So each of the stages is related to all other stages. And that's a very important thing. I'll explain that more, but it actually is an indication that you can actually go back at any point in your life to take a look at any of the previous tasks, or that you can even anticipate some of the future tasks in your journey. So this is a very helpful chart just to remind us how all these stages are integrated or related to each other. So most scholars believe that Erikson's greatest contribution was not so much in relation to childhood, although ironically his first book was called Childhood and Society. But most scholars really believe that his greatest contributions came beginning adolescence and adulthood, because his first stages, the first three stages of childhood, follow very closely Freud's psychosexual stages. So they are not very different from Freud's perspective. So for this reason, I'm concentrating here on the kind of the second half, beginning with adolescence, young adulthood, adulthood, and older adulthood. So I'll explain a little bit more of each of these. So the fifth stage is adolescence. We've all been there. We know how difficult it can be. The task of adolescence is identity versus identity confusion. And by identity, he meant a sense of progressive continuity or increasing congruence in our lives. So the sense that people know who you are or have a basic idea of who you are, and most importantly, that you have a basic idea of who you are. That's kind of what he meant by adolescence. Between the adolescent's childhood self and the adolescent anticipated future, there is a process of affirmation and repudiation. There is a sense in which the adolescent looks at his childhood and he likes some things about his childhood or her childhood, but then there are some things that he doesn't like about his childhood, right? So there's a process of repudiation. Well, there's also a process of affirmation. And then there's also a increasing congruence between the adolescent's self-understanding and their external world. So an adolescent who thinks the people look at him and understand him or her is someone who will feel better, right, about his basic sense of identity. So let me just underscore here that Erikson did not mean that an adolescent has to have everything figured out. We know that that doesn't happen, right? But at least some basic sense of identity, you know, some basic sense of who the person is in this world. So that's adolescence. Here's a quote from Erikson, one of his famous quotes regarding identity. He says, "In the social jungle of human existence, there is no feeling of being alive without a sense of ego identity." So we all have to have some kind of basic idea of who we are in order to thrive in this world. So the next stage is young adulthood. And the task, the psychosocial task here is intimacy versus isolation. And by intimacy, Erikson meant the capacity to make certain commitments and abide by those commitments despite required sacrifices. So when we say intimacy, our minds tend to go to relationships, emotional, romantic, even sexual relationships. And that is, without a doubt, part of what Erikson meant by intimacy. But as you can see in this definition, his understanding of intimacy was much broader, wider. So he actually meant any kind of commitment or affiliation that you make during young adulthood. And that's usually the time when we decide what kind of profession we're going to pursue. So we make academic commitments, vocational commitments. That's usually the time when people decide to go one way or the other in terms of politics, in terms of you know, sports, you know, what teams will be meaningful to them. You know, so a series of commitments or affiliations, despite the fact that some of these will require sacrifices. So you know, the greatest example is, of course, the young adult who decides to initiate a marital relationship. That person, of course, is renouncing to other possibilities, right? The moment we decide. And the same would be true if you decide to, you know, be a doctor. You are, of course, sacrificing the possibility of being an engineer or a minister. So that's what Erikson meant by commitments that entail certain sacrifices. And isolation is the dystonic element is the capacity to isolate oneself in order to protect one's identity and commitments. So here again, while a lot of isolation can be malignant to healthy development, a little bit of isolation is usually healthy during young adulthood. And this is a time when, you know, newly wed couples, they tend to distance themselves from the world and think, what happened to this couple? We've never see them again, right? Well, they just got married and they are doing exactly this. They are protecting their commitments and identity, trying to figure out how this new stage in their lives is going to work. So a little bit of isolation, Erikson would say, is necessary. What they are doing is actually protecting their newly acquired identity and affiliations. Now, Erikson made a very helpful, I think, a very helpful distinction between intimacies, with small I and plural, to refer to the ways in which young adults tend to, quote, experiment in friendship, love, and other areas of their lives. So in other words, he thought that and he didn't explain, he didn't go into details about what experimentation here means, but he was obviously implying some kind of, you know, relationships and meeting different partners, different people during this stage of your life. And he distinguished that from intimacy with a capital I, which is a more permanent sense of commitment that entails a firm identity in the making and a sense of mutuality. So that's when you actually begin perceiving your partner as a person and the relation between becomes mutual. It's not only about you, like the adolescent often thinks, but it's about you and your partner. So there's a sense of mutuality when you reach that sense of that time of intimacy with a capital I. Yes.
What about the Catholic faith decision to be celibate, the priest and the
Well, that's an excellent question. I don't know if Erikson ever thought about that, but you know, intimacy would entails, as we said, sexuality, but it's not only about sexuality. So in the case of you know, the Catholic idea of celibacy, or not only Catholic but predominantly Catholic, my guess is that he would say that that is one possible way of expressing one's sexuality, although obviously it's not for everyone. So I think it's a possibility, although it doesn't have obviously have to be the case for everyone. So my guess is that he, to my knowledge, he never actually addressed that question, but my guess is that he would say that you know, an individual who decides to embrace celibacy is you know, developing their own form of intimacy, perhaps an intimacy in relation to the divine, or an intimacy in relation to some other core value or belief that the person might hold. But that's a good question. Yeah, thank you.
Got about 5 minutes.
Oh, good to know. Good thing is that we have another Sunday, but
Yeah,
I don't have my watch here, so thank you for.
that was your 5-minute warning.
Yes, thank you. Well, that's good. We'll go into the 7th stage, which is adulthood. And of course, this is important. Many of us are in this stage. The task is generativity versus stagnation. What did Erikson mean by generativity? The concern for establishing and guiding the next generation. I thought this is a beautiful, I thought it was perhaps one of the most beautiful definitions. The concern for establishing and guiding the next generation, which is, I'm sure, part of the reason you are here. because you care for guiding, nourishing, accompanying the next or the future or future generations. Generativity had to do with the generations of new beings, so procreativity, but not only procreativity. It also had to do with new products, new ideas, and further identity development. So some people criticized Erikson because they thought he was only speaking about procreation, but he later clarified it, that it wasn't only about procreation, it was about extending your growth and with new ideas, new possibilities, new forms of developing. And the malignant element or the dystonic element in this stage is stagnation, a sense of self-absorption that might hinder our ability to care for others. Although he thought, again, that a little bit of stagnation at certain points in our lives actually propel us, help us move forward. And then I like this poem by Spanish poet Gloria Fuertes. To me, it illustrates in a beautiful way adulthood. She wrote, and this is my translation, "I wanted to go to war to stop it, but they stopped me halfway. Then I found myself in an office where I work as if I were stupid. But God and the doorman know that I am not. I ride by night and travel often to the country." I like this poem because it illustrates, that impetus that we have during our young adulthood to change the world, right? To stop the war, to end poverty, to all those causes. But then we realize that we have to work, right? And that we have to sustain our family, our children, that we have to go to the office. And sometimes we find ourselves kind of stuck in an office. And there's a sense in which we feel, maybe a little bit stupid, stuck. But then I love that the phrase, "But God and the doorman know that I am not." There's a way in which we continue. We continue to long and we continue to strive to reach our goals and to be committed to our beliefs and values. So she says, "I ride by night and travel often to the country." So I guess we'll stop there today, and we'll actually reach older adulthood next Sunday. If that way we'll talk about that way. But my hope is that you'll continue to think about these stages, and especially during this week, that you'll give permission to think about, are there any parts of your life that you would like to revisit from this point, from the point of the developmental theory? As I said, part of the beauty of this theory is that we can always go back to revisit. Actually, I have this, let me just show you this photograph, and I'll stop with that. But I like this photo from the movie Back to the Future, which became very popular during the pandemic. So we were all watching movies, right? But I like to say this about Erikson's theory. Erikson's life cycle theory allows you to travel in time. That is, to reflect or to reward tasks from the past or future stages. So it gives you permission to, get in the car, go back to your childhood, go back to your adolescence, and revisit anything that you would like to revisit, and then come back to the future. So in that sense, it's a very hopeful theory. And that, I think that's one of the reasons that pastoral theologians have identified very much with Erikson, because of that sense of hope. Our sense as ministers, as caregivers, is to instill hope. And in that sense, this theory is very congruent. So thank you.
Thank you, Ruben. Appreciate it. Okay, we'll see y'all next week. For those of you who attend in person, please remember to come to the rec room. We'll see you then. Thank you.
Yeah.